Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. We had been on mounted patrol for nearly 4 hours, heading back toward base when everything changed. Inside the Humvee sat 4 Marines: Sergeant Simon Hammond, myself, Lance Corporal Zachary Ramirez, Private Luke Buford, and our team leader, Corporal Grant Kaufman. I had just leaned over to Grant with a warning. Might want to keep your head down. This place isn't exactly welcoming. His response was flippant, almost daring. So what? Let them try. A sudden crack shattered the relative quiet, the unmistakable report of a .30 caliber sniper rifle. They say the shot you never hear is the one that kills you. 3 of us registered the sound. Grant never had the chance. A precise hole marred the skin just beneath his right eye, his helmet the only thing keeping his head from completely coming apart. Without a moment's hesitation, Buford swung into action, gripping the .30 caliber and unleashing a steady stream of suppressive fire as we tore away from the kill zone. Ramirez cursed, his voice sharp with frustration. What the hell was he thinking? He made himself a goddamn target. Grant had been off for weeks, reckless in a way that felt deliberate, like he was daring something, or someone, to take him down. That night, our unit gathered in silence, the weight of Grant's loss settling over us like a lead blanket. Captain Blackwell, our company commander, stepped into the room, his presence commanding but solemn. "Attention," he ordered, though his voice lacked its usual force. His gaze locked onto me. "Simon, I was going through Kaufman's things. There are some letters in here that you and the others need to read." Without another word, he set 2 envelopes on a bunk and walked out. I picked up the first one, instantly recognizing the handwriting. It was from Grant's wife. Skimming the lines, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach before I forced myself to read it aloud. "Grant, I'm sorry, but I've met someone else. I'm filing for divorce. The distance is just too much. Please stay safe, Elena." Sliding the letter back into its envelope, I opened the second, just a few days newer, but the words hit like a sledgehammer. My hands gripped the paper tighter as I read. "Hey Grant, remember me?" "Probably not. We never got along. Guess what? I've been seeing your soon-to-be ex-wife. She's incredible. We're getting married after the divorce. Hope you can make it to the wedding. If not, send a gift. Ashton." A wave of disgust spread through the room. Someone muttered, "What a piece of shit." The letter from Elena had been a wound, but this was a knife twisted deep. We all understood then. Grant hadn't just fallen to a sniper's bullet. He had been crumbling long before that shot was fired. The betrayal had drained the fight from him. Some of us, reservists from the same hometown, felt an unspoken agreement settle between us. When we got back, we'd make things right. None of us had been particularly close to Grant before deployment, but combat binds men in ways deeper than friendship. We owed him that much. I took charge, with Ramirez, Buford, and a handful of others backing me. Returning home meant slipping back into my old life. Simon Hammond, 29, single, Indiana University graduate, managing one of my father's tire stores. But the letters haunted me, tucked away with Captain Blackwell's silent approval. I showed them to my father, a Vietnam Marine veteran who needed no explanation. When I told him I might need some time off, he simply nodded. The first step was tracking down Grant's last known address. Of course, Elena had moved, leaving behind no trace. The neighbors had no clue where she had gone, but I had a hunch. She was with Ashton. I started frequenting bars near Grant's old neighborhood, blending in, keeping my ears open. Eventually, I met someone who knew both Grant and Elena. I kept it casual, steering clear of any mention of Grant's death. The guy mentioned seeing Elena at a place called Maggie's Bar. That was all I needed. I made Maggie's my new spot, showing up regularly, becoming a familiar face. And then, one night, luck struck. A group of about 15 co-workers walked in, and among them was a woman named Elena. She wasn't strikingly beautiful, but she had a presence, one that made it clear why she'd caught Grant's heart. If this was her, my plan was already forming. I've always had an easy way with women, a mix of charm and a well-maintained physique. It made the long nights in bars work in my favor. Among her group was a man who stood out, tall, broad, and carrying himself with the arrogance of a lifelong bully. Ashton. I eased my way in, joining a game of pool, working myself into their circle. Slowly, I became part of the scenery, a known figure in their after-work gatherings. Ashton didn't seem to like me, but Elena? She was warming up, bit by bit. I knew I was making progress when I caught the whispers, the glances, the subtle questions. I had become more than just another guy at the bar. I was inside their world now, and I was just getting started. I was fully aware that much of my initial appeal to the women came from the simple fact that I was a fresh face. That novelty, however, wouldn't last forever. I had to move fast before their curiosity faded, before I became just another regular in the crowd. That Thursday night, Maggie's was more crowded than usual. As I scanned the room, I spotted Elena arriving with a group of realtors. To my surprise, Ashton wasn't with her. As the dance floor filled up, I saw my chance. I asked Elena to dance, pulling her in just a little closer than before. She didn't resist. When the first song ended, I held onto her hand, guiding her into the next song without giving her a moment to step away. Again, no hesitation. When we finally left the floor, I kept hold of her hand as I walked her back to the table, sitting beside her with an air of confidence. I had spent enough time with this crowd to know that people were talking. Over the past few weeks, I had danced with most of the women in the office. By now, there were probably whispers about who I might pursue more seriously. If they were men, they'd likely have a betting pool running. After a few more dances with others, I returned to Elena and asked her again. This time, while swaying together, I casually asked for her number. She pretended not to hear me. Later, as we sat side by side, her hand still loosely resting in mine, I felt something slip into my palm beneath the table. In that instant, everything clicked into place. Elena had never been faithful, not to Ashton, not even to Grant. When Grant was deployed, she hadn't waited. She had sent him a cold, impersonal letter cutting ties. She hadn't caused his death. That blame rested on Ashton, but anyone who had known Grant understood that Elena had played a role in his downfall. Now, she had achieved her small victory, securing my attention, earning bragging rights. For her, this wasn't really about me. It was about Ashton. But then again, who was Ashton, really? Despite everything, I struggled to keep my thoughts focused on my larger goal, avenging Grant. Instead, my mind kept drifting to Jeannie. No matter how much I tried to push her from my thoughts, she always found a way back in. It irritated me, this unshakable fixation. I had learned a few things about her. She was divorced, had no kids, and stood around 5'10" with striking blonde hair. And despite all logic, I realized I was falling for her. My strategy had been simple. Get close to Elena, drive a wedge between her and Ashton, and then take them down one at a time. But in order to make Elena believe I was genuinely choosing her, I had to ignore Jeannie. That night at Maggie's, she was there, watching. There was something in her eyes, soft, almost pleading. It killed me to pretend I didn't notice. A few days after securing Elena's number, I invited her to dinner. She hesitated, mentioning her supposed commitment to Ashton. But in the end, she agreed. She suggested a quiet place across town, Louage's. We met at a Wendy's parking lot, far from the apartment she shared with Ashton, then drove together for the 30-minute trip to the restaurant. Dinner was pleasant, accompanied by a bottle of wine. Afterward, I suggested a nearby bar my friends had recommended. She agreed. We danced, had a couple more drinks, and before long, she was leaning into me. I asked if she wanted to come over for a nightcap, offering some brandy I promised she'd enjoy. Before she had time to think, I pulled her close, our lips crashing together in a heated kiss. The alcohol buzzed through us, making every decision feel inevitable. Once we arrived at my apartment, I helped her out of the car, our hands interlocked as we stepped inside. We never even touched the brandy at first. For all my talk of revenge, I had been without intimacy for too long. The moment took over. Nothing else mattered. Her relationship with Ashton, my grudge against her, none of it. Right then, my only focus was taking what I wanted. Despite my resentment toward Elena, I let myself indulge. Later, after a drink and a quick shower, I drove her back to her car. I knew Elena would make sure the news got out. Women like her didn't keep secrets. It would spread, whispered from one person to the next, and eventually, everyone would know. What bothered me most wasn't that the office would hear about it. It was the fact that Jeannie would. A week later, I stopped by Maggie's after work. The moment I stepped inside, a few of the women greeted me with cheers and knowing glances. I took a seat at the bar, barely settling in before Ashton stormed in, flanked by two imposing men. He wasted no time confronting me. He claimed Elena told him I had been bothering her and her friends, pestering them while they were just trying to enjoy their night. His voice was full of warning, laced with barely contained anger. The bartender intervened before things got out of hand, and after issuing his final threat, Ashton stormed out. The rumors had reached him, that much was clear. Elena had spun the story, covering her tracks by making it sound like I had been the pursuer, not the other way around. He had no idea what had really happened, no idea that she had spent an entire night in my bed. It was time to escalate. I reached out to two of my most trusted allies, Zachary Ramirez and Luke Buford. Zachary was all muscle, a relentless force in the gym. Luke, the easygoing one, had an unmatched ability to remain level-headed in the heat of battle. They listened as I laid out the plan. We chose Tuesday or Thursday, Ashton's usual nights at Maggie's, for the confrontation. By Thursday, everything was in place. When I spotted Ashton alone, without his usual entourage, I knew this was the moment. I walked up to him, reminding him of his threats from the week before. Then, with deliberate ease, I let it slip. That night at Maggie's, it had been just Elena and me. Dinner at Luigi's, dancing. And afterward, we had gone back to my place. The truth hung in the air between us, heavy and unshakable. This was just the beginning. She's remarkable in ways you might not expect. Those 3 small moles on her inner left thigh, just above her hip, touch them, and she reacts instantly. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, it's been good talking. I've got plans tonight, so I need to get moving. Thursday is when it all goes down. Ashton won't let this slide. He needs his retribution, and that's the next time we'll cross paths. My only concern is that he might take things too far with Elena and end up behind bars. If that happens, we'll just wait for his release and go through this all over again. I can't help but laugh, picturing Ashton making Elena undress just to verify those moles. They're real. I saw them with my own eyes when she was in my bed. I made sure to memorize every little detail, things only someone who had truly been with her would know. By the time Thursday arrived, everything was set. Luke Buford got to Maggie's at 6 sharp, took a stool at the bar, and nursed a beer while keeping an eye on things. He called me with an update. He spotted Ashton right away, exactly as I had described. But he wasn't alone. 3 heavy-set guys loitered nearby, not mingling with the crowd, just standing apart, watching. Ashton kept pacing between them and the others, as if he didn't quite belong to either group. Then Luke noticed her, a woman with a black eye and a swollen forehead. I described Elena, and he confirmed it was her. Ashton must have found the marks. I walked into the bar around 6:30, found a seat, and waited. It took a moment to recognize Luke. By 7:15, as the last light faded outside, Ashton finally made his move. "That's it, asshole," he seethed. "You've had your fun. Elena played her games with me, and now it's your turn. But you won't get off as easy as she did." I ordered another beer, making sure the bartender caught every word. If anyone needed to know who started it, he'd be the perfect witness. "All right," I said, turning to Ashton. "What's your plan?" He sneered. "If you're not a coward, step outside." He gave me a shove toward the door. His goons stayed behind, pretending this was a fair fight. I stood up, glanced at the bartender, and walked toward the exit. The bar owner, sensing what was coming, instinctively reached for the phone, probably dialing 911. I shook my head, signaling him to hold off. Meanwhile, my friend Luke Buford remained at the bar, chatting idly on the phone, looking like he had no concerns in the world. The second we were outside, the situation escalated. Ashton's 3 friends followed, but before they could act, everything turned upside down. For every man who stepped out that door, 2 Marines were waiting. Two of Ashton's guys quickly realized they were outmatched. They took a few hard punches, hit the ground, and stayed down. The third was a bit slower on the uptake. He didn't stop until his nose was broken. Ashton, though, wasn't going to get off so lightly. This was for Grant. Ashton took blow after blow, punches, kicks, stomps. Every time he tried to get up, he was knocked right back down. He'd need an ambulance before the night was over. I could have stayed out of it, but I still landed one solid hit to his jaw, because I wanted to. Later, we found out that if Ashton ever walked again, it would be with a cane. And as for fathering kids, not likely. To an outsider, it might seem like overkill, vengeance taken too far. But for what Ashton had done, he was lucky. He was still breathing. Grant never got that chance. Before we called 911, I made sure to tuck a copy of the letter into my pocket. One day, Ashton would see it and understand exactly why this happened. When the dust settled, only Ashton and I remained. His so-called friends just wanted to get out of there. They weren't too hurt, but they knew better than to push their luck. The Marines, satisfied that justice had been served, got in their cars and disappeared into the night. The cops showed up after the ambulance left with Ashton. They spoke briefly with the bar owner, took some notes, and left. I figured they'd get to me eventually, but Ashton had started it, so there wasn't much left to ask. Inside, the bar was hushed. Everyone had heard the fight, but no one had dared to step outside. I sat down at a table, locking eyes with Elena. Pulling out 2 letters, I began speaking. Some of you knew Grant Kaufman through his wife, Elena. You probably heard he was killed in action. But what you don't know is that Grant didn't just die. He gave up. He received these 2 letters, 1 week apart. One from Elena, the other from Ashton. I placed the letters on the table. He was so broken that he stopped fighting. Let the enemy fire take him. I slid the letters forward. Pass them around. Read them if you want. I was there when Grant fell. And what you heard outside? That was his Navy brothers letting Ashton know exactly what they thought of his damn letter. The next day, I found myself in the parking lot of a commercial real estate office, watching the layoff crowd trickle out. A few familiar faces from Maggie's passed by. I nodded to those who recognized me. Eventually, the one I had been waiting for appeared. As she approached, I rolled down the window and called her name. She looked surprised but made her way over. "Hey, Simon," she said. "What's up?" "Jeannie," I replied. "I'd like to explain everything that's been happening with me and a couple of your co-workers." She smiled, walked around the car, and slid into the passenger seat. "How about now?" she asked. "Somewhere other than Maggie's." And just like that, my life changed forever. From that moment, we were inseparable. Jeannie became a part of my world, meeting my family, spending time with my parents and siblings. They all loved her. Eventually, she joined the family business, working with us at the tire shop. 2 years later, we gave my parents their first grandchildren, twin daughters. Ashton never went back to work. His injuries left him on disability. Elena stuck around for a bit, but eventually left town after those letters kept resurfacing. Sometimes I reflect on how lucky I am, how blessed I was to have Jeannie and our girls, and I think of Corporal Grant Kaufman, who never got the chance to have what I do, all because of those damn letters. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you. Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. After an exhausting day at work, I walked into the house, my body aching with fatigue. All I wanted was a comforting meal, a moment of peace, and perhaps a chance to reconnect with my wife. That didn't seem like too much to ask. But instead of solace, I was greeted by an eerie silence and the unmistakable smell of reheated leftovers, or worse, takeout. The dining table was buried under an avalanche of shopping bags, each emblazoned with the names of luxury brands, flaunting their expense. Setting down my briefcase, I couldn't help but notice the irony. I was working myself to the bone to provide for this household, while she lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging my presence. "Hey," I said, trying to mask my growing frustration with a light-hearted tone. "What's for dinner?" Without looking up, she replied, "I ordered something. It should be here soon." Her nonchalance wasn't surprising. This had become a pattern. The meals she once cooked with care, her signature lasagna, hearty stews, felt like distant memories. The kitchen, once alive with the smells and sounds of home, now seemed abandoned, reduced to a decorative space. It wasn't just the meals that had changed. The entire house bore the marks of neglect. Piles of dishes filled the sink, laundry sat untouched, and the floors, once gleaming, were now dull and dirty. I didn't want to pick a fight. I was too drained. But as I surveyed the mess around me, resentment simmered beneath the surface. I was pouring everything into my work, sacrificing sleep and peace of mind, just to ensure we lived comfortably. And this was what I came home to? A wife who seemed to have checked out, indifferent to the home and the effort I put into sustaining it. Later that evening, after the takeout containers were tossed and the silence between us had become unbearable, I decided to bring it up. "We need to talk," I said cautiously. She rolled her eyes, her annoyance clear. "About what?" "This. Us. I can't keep doing this by myself. I need you to meet me halfway," I said, choosing my words carefully. Her response was sharper than I expected. "I didn't marry you to be your maid or your chef. If you want that, hire someone." Her words hung in the air, cold and unyielding. My mind reeled. This wasn't the woman I had married, the one who once cared deeply about our relationship, our home, and me. I tried to explain my feelings, to reason with her, but she dismissed me with a wave of her hand. "I don't have time for this nonsense," she said flatly. It was in that moment that I realized just how far apart we had drifted. She wasn't just neglecting the house, she was neglecting us. It felt like I had been reduced to a paycheck, my role limited to financing her extravagant lifestyle. The worst part? She didn't even seem to care. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, exhaustion gave way to anger. Something had to change. The next morning, the tension between us was palpable before I even got out of bed. She was already in the living room, sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, I was preparing for another grueling day at work. Part of me wanted to let the issue slide again, to avoid confrontation, but something inside me refused to stay silent this time. I grabbed my coffee and sat across from her, determined to speak. "Look," I began, keeping my voice steady. "I don't think you understand how much this is wearing me down. I come home completely drained, and it feels like I'm the only one holding everything together." She barely glanced up from her phone. When she finally did, her irritation was evident. "Why are we having this conversation again?" she asked, exasperated. "I told you I'm not your maid. I'm not here to cater to your every whim." Her detachment hit me like a slap. "That's not what I'm asking for," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I want a partner. Someone who values this relationship as much as I do." Her laughter was bitter, almost mocking. "You think this is some kind of partnership? Let me make something clear," she said, her tone icy. "I didn't sign up to be a housewife. If that's what you want, you married the wrong person." Her words chilled me. She had drawn a line in the sand, making it clear she had no intention of changing, compromising, or even acknowledging my efforts. "What about us?" I asked, my frustration bubbling over. "Don't you care about what's happening to us?" She let out a dramatic sigh, as if bored. "I've already told you," she said dismissively. "If you want a wife who cooks and cleans, you married the wrong woman. I'm not changing." The chasm between us had never felt wider. To her, our marriage wasn't a partnership, but a transaction. My hard work funding her comforts. Standing by the door, ready to leave for work, I looked back at her. She was flipping through TV channels, utterly unconcerned. "This can't go on," I said quietly. Something has to change. Her response was as cutting as ever. Then maybe you should figure out what you really want, because I'm not changing. Her words echoed in my mind all day. It wasn't just the content, but the way she said it. So detached, so indifferent. Over lunch, I scrolled through old photos of us during happier times, searching for the moment when everything began to unravel. I didn't find an answer, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep living like this. That evening, I returned home with a decision. If she wasn't willing to change, then I would. Quietly, I went to the bedroom, logged into our shared accounts, and canceled her extra credit cards. I left her one, with a strict spending limit. If she wanted more, she'd have to earn it herself. The next morning, I woke early and began reviewing our finances. Seeing the extravagant purchases, designer bags, fine dining, luxurious spa trips, only fueled my resolve. I didn't confront her directly. Instead, I let my actions speak. It didn't take long for her to notice. That evening, she burst into the room, phone in hand, fuming. "Why is my card being declined?" she demanded. Without looking up, I replied calmly, "I adjusted the limits. If you want to spend more, you'll need to contribute." Her reaction was exactly what I expected. "I'm your wife, not some employee you can boss around." "What's your problem?" she snapped, her tone sharp with indignation. I closed my book with deliberate care, meeting her gaze evenly. My voice was calm, but firm. "And I'm your husband, not an endless source of cash. If you're unwilling to contribute to our life together, then it's time you start taking responsibility for yourself." Her cheeks turned a deep shade of red, anger radiating from her in waves. "So this is your way of punishing me for not being the submissive housewife? How pathetic." "No," I said steadily. "This is about setting boundaries. If you don't want to be a real partner in this marriage, that's your choice. But relying on me without accountability isn't something I'll allow anymore." The following days were heavy with silence, broken only by her passive-aggressive remarks and veiled jabs. "I guess this means you don't care about me anymore," she would say with a theatrical sigh. I refused to waver. When her card was declined as she tried to purchase an expensive pair of shoes, her frustration boiled over. She lashed out, accusing me of being controlling. I kept my composure, repeating what I'd already made clear. If you want the finer things, you'll need to earn them. What surprised me was how quickly the dynamic began to shift. She spent more time away, surrounded by friends who eagerly indulged her complaints about me. She painted herself as the victim, but I didn't let it get under my skin. This wasn't about seeking her approval. It was about reclaiming my own peace. For the first time in years, I felt like I was rediscovering who I was. It wasn't about the money. It was about respect. I had spent far too long prioritizing her happiness, only to realize that her joy was tied not to our relationship, but to what I could provide. I was done being her safety net. Each night, as I lay in bed, clarity settled over me like a long-lost friend. This wasn't just about finances. It was about defining what I would and wouldn't accept. With each passing day, I grew closer to making a decision I'd once thought unthinkable. The cracks in her carefully curated facade began to show. The first sign came when the doorbell rang, and I overheard her fumbling for excuses to a delivery driver whose payment she couldn't complete. Her explanations were laughable, claims of bank errors and technical glitches, before she slammed the door in frustration. I didn't comment. I simply observed as she grappled with her new reality. The adjustments weren't limited to one incident. In the days that followed, her frustration turned to desperation. She began rummaging through old clothes, trying to repurpose them since shopping sprees were no longer an option. Her favorite spa left a voicemail about a missed appointment. She deleted it without a word. Invitations from her friends to their usual luxurious outings were met with vague excuses about being busy or unwell. But I knew the truth. Her social life was crumbling without my financial support. One evening, I found her sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. Her nails, usually immaculate, were chipped, and her bare face betrayed exhaustion. I poured myself a glass of water, waiting for her to speak. "I'm trying," she said, her voice strained. "But you're making it impossible." Leaning against the counter, I took a slow sip. "Trying to make what work? Your lifestyle? The one I've been funding while you contribute nothing?" Her head shot up, her eyes blazing. "You're being cruel." "Cruel?" I set my glass down with a deliberate motion. "Cruel is expecting me to shoulder this marriage alone. Cruel is ignoring the effort I've put in every day. Cruel is acting like a victim when all I've asked for is basic respect and partnership." Her expression faltered, and for the first time, I saw doubt flicker in her eyes. Slowly, her anger gave way to an uneasy silence. Her sarcastic remarks dwindled, replaced by half-hearted attempts to tidy the house or offer small gestures of acknowledgement. But they felt hollow, more like a performance than genuine effort. Even her friends began to notice. One called while she was out, asking if everything was okay. "She's seemed different lately," they said. I offered a curt response. "She's fine," and ended the call. But we both knew she wasn't fine. The comfortable life she'd built was unraveling, and for the first time, there was no safety net beneath her. One night, as we sat across from each other over a simple dinner I'd prepared, she broke the silence. "I've been thinking," she began hesitantly, "maybe I haven't been fair to you." Her admission was quiet, almost reluctant, but it was the first time she acknowledged her role in our struggles. I waited, giving her space to say more, but she simply stared at her plate, shoulders heavy with the weight of her words. Her behavior didn't return to what it had been, but her efforts to change were tentative at best. Small, sporadic acts of contrition appeared, but they lacked sincerity. My patience, already threadbare, began to evaporate. A week later, she approached me as I worked in the living room. Standing in the doorway, she looked almost fragile. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly, gripping the frame as though it grounded her. I closed my laptop and gestured for her to sit. Perching on the edge of the couch, she fidgeted nervously. "I've been thinking," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor, "about what you said, about how I've treated you. And you're right. I've taken you for granted." Her voice cracked as she continued. "I got too comfortable. I didn't see how much I was hurting you. But I don't want to lose you. I promise I'll do better." Her words were sincere, even raw, but they couldn't erase years of disappointment and resentment. I leaned forward, speaking carefully. "I hear you," I said evenly, "and I appreciate you owning up to it. But an apology alone can't fix this. The trust and respect we once had are gone." Her face crumpled as the weight of my words hit her. For the first time, she seemed to truly grasp the depth of the damage. And while her admission was a step forward, it couldn't undo what had already been broken. "I don't think this is something that can ever be repaired." Her expression tightened, her features folding under the weight of emotions she struggled to contain. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though she might completely break down, but instead, she straightened, summoning a fragile composure. Desperation quickly overtook sorrow as she pleaded, "I can change. I'll do anything. Just give me one more chance," she implored, her voice trembling with urgency. But I shook my head, the decision I had made bearing down heavily on me. "You've had more chances than I can count," I said, my tone soft but resolute. "And every time, you chose yourself over us." She reached for my hand, grasping it tightly, as though it could somehow bridge the chasm between us. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of her tears. "I love you." I gently withdrew my hand, firm yet tender. "I needed your love when it truly mattered," I said. "When I came home exhausted and just needed someone to be there for me. When I asked for help, and you turned me away. Love isn't enough anymore. Not after everything. Her tears streamed down her face in silent rivulets, and I felt no sense of victory, no satisfaction, only a profound sadness. This wasn't how I had imagined it would end, but it was the only path forward. She lingered for a while, her quiet sobs filling the space as I sat in silence. Eventually, she rose and left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The woman I had once loved so deeply, the one with whom I had built a life, now felt like a stranger. No promises or tears could change that. After that night, the house sank into a silence that felt more suffocating than peaceful. She moved into the guest room, avoiding me entirely. The pleading stopped. There were no more hollow promises or vows to change. It seemed she had finally grasped what I had been trying to say for weeks. The bridge between us was gone, and there was no rebuilding it. One quiet Saturday morning, I awoke with a firm decision. It was time to close this chapter of my life. As I walked through the stillness of the house, I couldn't help but notice the remnants of what we had once tried to build together. The wedding photo on the mantel, the decor she had chosen with care, the expensive furniture we had barely used. Each item felt like an artifact of a partnership that no longer existed. I grabbed a roll of garbage bags and began to pack her belongings: clothes, designer handbags, shoes that likely cost more than my entire wardrobe. One by one, I placed them into the black bags. With each item I removed, it felt as though I was shedding a burden I had carried for far too long. The bitterness and anger had long since faded, replaced by a quiet resolve. By the time she woke up, I was nearly done. She entered the living room, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and froze at the sight of the bags stacked by the door. Confusion flickered across her face before morphing into disbelief and then anger. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "This is me moving on," I replied, my tone steady but unwavering. "I've carried this relationship alone for too long. I'm done. You need to leave." Her eyes widened, shock overtaking her anger. For a moment, I thought she might argue. Instead, she crossed her arms, her voice dropping into a defensive sneer. "You can't just throw me out. Where am I supposed to go?" "That's not my responsibility anymore," I said evenly. "You've made it clear you don't need me, so prove it. Go live the life you think you deserve, but do it without me." She stared at me as though seeing a stranger. Perhaps she was. For the first time in years, I was standing up for myself in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her defiance wavered, and her voice softened into one last quiet plea. "I can change," she murmured. "We can fix this." I shook my head, my resolve unshaken. "You had the opportunity to change, to fix things when it mattered most. I'm not angry anymore, but I can't live like this. I deserve better." Her silence was deafening. She turned and walked away, retreating to the guest room. I didn't follow. Instead, I finished packing her belongings and left the bags by the door. That afternoon, she called a friend to pick her up. She left without a word, carrying the bags with her as she stepped out the door without a backward glance. I watched from the window as the car disappeared down the street, and for the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of relief. The house was quiet, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't stifling, it was liberating. In the weeks that followed, I began reclaiming my life. I rearranged the furniture, took down the wedding photos, and donated the things we had accumulated but no longer served me. Slowly, the house transformed into a space that felt wholly mine, a place where I could finally breathe freely. Friends began reaching out, checking in on me. I told them the truth. I was better than I had been in years. I reconnected with people, spent more time outdoors, and rediscovered the things that once brought me joy. Bit by bit, I felt myself returning to the person I had been before. One evening, as I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sun set behind the horizon, I felt something unfamiliar. Peace. The resentment, the exhaustion, the frustration. It was all gone. In their place was a quiet contentment I hadn't known in years. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future and the limitless possibilities it held. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.